I think what we're going to do, we're going to start in a second. Just so you know, all we're going to do is really have a conversation with microphones, and hopefully you can, jump in. We'll ask, get you to ask some questions if you want towards the end, but I'm going to sort of start with these guys first. This is really just a roundtable discussion, watchers. What I really wanted to ask the panel was, what they think has changed over the last year in terms of, well, in all sorts of terms, everything to do with watchmaking. Let me introduce you to the panel at the end. We've got Ken Kessler, Elizabeth Dorr, Peter Roberts, who's a fabulous watchmaker, and our friend Mr. Andrew Carrier, who's also another watch writer of growing repute, indeed. And he will not be live tweeting, I hope. It strikes me that this industry is moving ever faster. So I want to really look at sort of what's happened over the last sort of year. And the first little question I've got is, who's the brand that's made the sort of the biggest strides forward in the last 12 months? Sorry, these are unprepared questions, by the way.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Spontaneously, since these are spontaneous questions, I think of two brands, particularly being here in Britain, Bremont. They've really moved forward this year. I think the Ronnie Wood collaboration has jumped them miles ahead in recognition. But also, from in my opinion, Hermes. This year with the time suspended watch, I mean, it's you like it or you don't like it, but it's going in a different direction for this brand, and I think it's bringing them up to a new level.
Indeed.
Well, because my interest tends to be historical, I'm mostly impressed by the way Jaeger-LeCoultre has been handling its heritage. I thought that the Reverso 1931 was a magnificent effort, because sometimes replicas, people just lose it. And the diving watches, and especially with the, I think it's called the Deep Sea, they did both editions because the European market had a different model than the US market 50 years ago, and they had the integrity to do both. I believe the US one would just say LeCoultre. So I thought, for handling heritage at a time when people are getting sick of retro, I think Jaeger-LeCoultre really nailed it.
Yeah, well, I think I sort of look at it from more a technical point of view when I walk around these places and look at the watches. And I think the two companies that have sort of caught my eye this year is Heritage. Ken used the word heritage, but there's a company actually called Heritage Watches. I spent some time with them, having a look at what they're doing, and I love what they're doing on the movements. They're beautifully made movements, but they're concentrating on the sort of traditions of timekeeping. That's the balance, the escapement, and such like of the watch, and making a very, very simple to look at movement. But if you know something about what they're doing there, it's very, very advanced, but it's traditional watchmaking. I don't think there's any silicone in there or any sort of clever materials or such like. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with those materials, but it's nice to see what they're doing. And the other company that's sort of come to mind this year is Urban Jurgensen, which is, they produced a watch that was started by Derek Platt, who was an English watchmaker, worked in Switzerland, died unfortunately a few years ago. But he started a watch with a very special escapement, a pivoted detent escapement. And this has been finished by Jurgensen, and again, very, very nice, and the sort of thing that appeals to me. It's a beautiful horology, a difficult task, but they've achieved it. So they're two that come to mind for me.
Yeah, I think Ken stole the first thing that came to my mind. I was thinking about Jaeger-LeCoultre as well, because I think, when I think about trends in the last 12 months or so in this industry, one of them is the sort of the return to elegance, I think, a move away from the big and the bling and something that is more elegant again, and the Reverso certainly encapsulates that. And I think, I guess the other thing that sprang to my mind was there's kind of been a move towards perhaps more relevance in the sense that it's one of the awful things about being a watch collector is people who are not into watches often question why you'd want to spend that sort of money on something which, you can buy a much cheaper quartz watch that will do the job better in the sense that it'll tell the time better. So I was quite impressed with the TAG micro timer, just in terms of the huge leaps forward that they've made in accuracy there. If they just keep the thing wound up for more than 90 seconds, they might have a product on their hands, I think.
That's a fair point, I think. I don't think even TAG would argue about that. It's actually one of the sort of notes I'd made to myself to talk about was heritage, as well as looking over the last year. Obviously, a couple of weeks ago, George Daniels, who was, in quote marks, the greatest living watchmaker, and probably was. I'm not a person to comment. But nevertheless, he seems to have established the idea of making watches in a really traditional way that really hardly looks at the future, let alone the present, let alone the future. I wonder. It seems to me this is actually a valid way of going forward, and obviously Roger Smith's making great strides following that line. I want to ask the panel: is Roger Smith a one-off, or is this something we're going to see more of along the lines of, say, Urban Jurgensen as well?
Yeah, I think it's quite valid. I mean, the company I mentioned earlier, the Heritage Watches, this is the sort of area they're going into. And the big manufacturers are also working very much with traditional methods of horology. At the same time, you have to go into whatever materials, whatever technologies are available to us. And these areas are changing. Elizabeth's written many articles on this area with silicon usage. It's not new now, silicon. It's been going for a few years. Various companies are looking into it. My feeling, though, is when the top-end companies use these materials, it's very good that they can do so, and we need those companies to push this technology through. But I do feel that technology will then percolate down into the normal watch and probably be not the sort of technology that the high-end company will really require for the future. Because I think what's always made the very, very top watches sell is you're buying something very, very special to put on your wrist. You're not buying the latest technology. If you take the iPhone out or your iPad or something, that's where the latest technology really is. My wristwatch doesn't have to have that inside it. And I think this is why all the big companies will always go back, as well as looking into the future, they'll always go back to traditional methods of making watches.
But this is something that in other fields, the ultra-modern and the traditional have always coexisted. And ironically, it's quite new for the watch industry, which is so mature. If you look prior to the arrival of silicon, there was very little in the way of new materials between, say, 1950 and 1990. There were very few changes, maybe in lubricants, but I don't recall, aside from things like a wooden case for the Tissot or the Rock watch. Whereas in automobiles, you've had people who have insisted on manual gearboxes when others are coming up with state-of-the-art automatic transmissions. In audio, vinyl continues in the day of the download. So this industry is so huge now and so varied, but equally it's so crowded with competitors that what we've got is a cross to bear. Just as every company deals with tradition, if they're staying with mechanical, at the same time they have to look to the future. And I think that it's not divisive in a competitive or combative way, but there will be watch fanatics that don't care about the materials, the ones that tend towards the vintage, and then there are ones who are actually attracted by it. You've got brands like De Bethune, along with Patek, along with Ulysse Nardin, who can actually use that as a selling point for people that are what I guess you call early adopters. So I think both, they complement each other.
Yeah, I also think that these technologies, not only silicon, but also Liga materials, are in more watches than you even think. I think today you need to actually ask before you buy if you don't want these materials, because it's probably in almost every high-end watch these days. I'm wearing this year's Moonwatch, the Omega Speedmaster. It's a test watch I'm wearing this month. It happens to have a coaxial movement invented by George. and a silicon balance spring. I haven't really noticed any difference in its performance, but I also know that the Swatch Group is pushing heavily, and that in the next couple of years, every watch coming out of the Swatch Group will probably have Liga Silicon or whatever the step beyond is, because I've been told or hinted at that this is also not the end. That the Liga led to the Silicon is leading to whatever the next step is, which is still secret. They know, we don't know yet. But unfortunately, all new high-end watches have some Liga part in them, if not silicon. And if you don't want it, you better ask before you buy.
Or buy vintage.
Maybe they should put it on the wrapper.
Do you think that there are a lot of people who really don't want it? I mean, who are sort of fierce traditionalists in that sense? Do you come across that?
I don't want it. Period. I will not buy a watch for me, for my own personal use, with Liga or silicon in it. I do not want it. I prefer traditional materials, and there's a simple reason. They can always be fixed. I mean, think about your Omega, your digital Omega you bought in the 70s. 20 years later, it craps out on you, and you go back to Omega. Hey, I need this fixed. No chance. They can't fix it. It's way too expensive to fix. It's much cheaper to go and buy a new $10,000 watch than to fix that. And Liga parts, silicon parts, they're made with wafer technology. So if I don't know, 10 years down the road, a brittle, odd silicon chips or something, you can't even just stick another one in there. It has to come from the same wafer, because it's all like a balance and a balance spring. They have to be married. They have to, right?
Ultimately, these parts will be cheaper as well. I mean, the manufacturers are doing this not just for technological reasons. These materials are very good for magnetism, non-knee and the lubrication, etc. But they will be much, much cheaper to make. If the manufacturer can mold a balance spring with the collet, the stud, everything in one go, it saves so much money. This is why I, again, come back to my thought that they will come down into the ordinary watches. And there'll be Liga and silicon in all, and other materials in ordinary watches. But, for the future, exactly as you say, you can't repair these things. You can't do anything with them. The spring breaks, that's the end of it. You cannot repin it or anything, which I can do if you bring me a 50-year-old Longines where the balance spring's broken. I can just repin it for you, no problem at all. Time the watch.
Just to keep looking back a little bit, George Daniels, obviously, he made a lot of difference. I wonder what you guys think the legacy is, if it's not too cold a question.
Oh, I just don't feel qualified to answer that. My love of watches is, I think, a lot more about design than it is about the mechanics. So I wouldn't venture an answer to that.
Yeah, well, I knew George, and many, many times he asked me extremely difficult questions. If he was in the audience now, we would really be suffering out here, because he was so... He wouldn't be in the audience, but let's imagine...
We wouldn't let him.
Yeah, because it would be a nightmare out here, because I would say something, one of us would say something, and George would come back and say, but why did you do that? Why is it done this way? And he was so incisive in his ability to spot any sort of rubbish that you were talking or anything you were doing. I mean, many years ago, I was doing a clock for students. He very kindly came round to us to show the students some watches. And I was developing a watch with a clock with a duplex escapement on top, because it was a nice thing to do, and it was something we could just about make with the level of students we had. And his first thing is, why duplex? Because I like it, because we can make... I didn't know what to say. George had that effect on you anyway. He sort of looked at you and you sort of, mind went blank. And he just kept saying, but why a duplex? Why not another escapement? Why don't you develop a new... It was terrifying. It absolutely broke me at the time. And off he went, and I said, why am I making a duplex? But we made it, and it just about worked in the end. But that's George. But he was a marvellous man. I mean, the greatest watchmaker of the last and this century. I don't think anyone will ever match him again, because he came at a time when watchmaking was really suffering with the effect of the electronic watch, and he just sat there and made watches his own way. But he was a lateral thinker. I'm not going to make ordinary escapements. I'm going to make my own escapement. I'm going to get rid of friction. I'm going to get rid of lubrication. Marvellous, just one of those geniuses that come along once in a while. It must be like a Harrison. where did Harrison come from? You know, Barrow in Furness. But where did all that ability come from? But that was George.
Well, for me, and this shows the difference between me as a writer and Peter, who's a watchmaker, I think George also has a legacy that will, I'm afraid, be overlooked because his watchmaking was so truly monumental. For me, the achievements that George should also be remembered for is his writing. To me, one of the most important things in my career as a journalist and as a writer in my formative years was reading The Art of Breguet, which was one of the first important books, along with our late colleague Michael Balfour. There were very few watch books around then that weren't about pocket watches. Back when James was starting, when all of us were starting in the journalism side, watches were a brave new world. And if you wanted to know anything, you got a hold of George's books. And as Peter said, he was incisive, he was clear. If you read something by George, I don't care how clumsy you are, if you're like me, I can barely hold a screwdriver, but you left reading one of his books feeling educated. And he probably did more to forward writing about watches than just about anyone since, was it Clutton, or who wrote the watchmaking book? Carl, was it? De Carl. So I'm afraid that'll be overlooked, but I want people to remember George for that too.
I agree with everything you've all said. But I think what most people, or what most watchmakers will have to live up to was George's ability to make an entire watch by hand. Has that ever been done? I don't think so. And he made how many? 37?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how George did it all. I mean, there's just not enough hours in the day. I mean, because he was also, he had a thing about motorbikes. He was restoring cars, Bentley cars. Half the time he'd be under the bonnet of the car, and I've had the same weakness myself sometimes. And if you spend a weekend working on a car engine, you cannot go near a watch on Monday morning. You will break it. You lose that touch. It takes, really, I'm not kidding. It takes about a day to get over what you've done. But George did it, and he produced all those watches. Yeah, it's miraculous, absolutely miraculous.
Yeah, if you're tempted to go out and read some George Daniels, I'd avoid Practical Watch Escapement unless you really know what you're talking about. It's quite hard work, but it's very true. I was talking to a collector quite recently who was saying that the book he wrote, called simply Watchmaking, was the first book to really look at vintage watches from the mechanical sense, rather than previously all the attention had been on the dial, the case, the aesthetics, to the expense of the mechanics. He was the one who realised that actually people like Breguet were worth celebrating for their pure engineering talent as well. So I have to say I agree.
Well, I would like to also take this opportunity to mention our dear friend Michael Balfour, who passed away, because, and again, especially with Peter being involved with Bremont, people are finally waking up to the fact that the watch industry isn't Swiss, it's English. Not British, but English. All of the great inventions were pre-Breguet. The lever escapement, all of that stuff was really English. Michael did for journalism what George did for technical writing, because Michael started writing watch books when there were none. I mean, wristwatch books. You could find the odd thing in Germany or in Italy, because those markets were, I think Italy, France, and Germany were ahead of the rest in watch collecting.
Germany is very rich in literature.
Absolutely.
It just hasn't been translated into English.
And that's the problem. Whereas Michael, for the English language, started doing this for newspapers, and he wrote, I think it was the Classic Wristwatch, which has got to be 25, 30 years ago. And what Michael had that was fantastic is he was an elegant writer, because he came from a discipline. He was a book publisher, and people who were lucky enough to know Michael knew that regardless of the time of day that you found him, which could be breakfast with a bottle of wine or late at night with brandy, Michael could tell you stories about the watch industry that added depth. I'm not saying they were unpublishable, but he knew people in a way that we don't, because he worked in the industry when it was, as Peter defined it, there was in trouble, and the mechanical watch looked like it was going to die. He was working through the tail end of the quartz era, and I spoke to him about this. It wasn't conscious, it wasn't deliberate, it was commercial. A publisher asked him to write a book about watch collecting at a time when no one knew that it was going to enable James to establish a magazine, for example. And he
Sure.
did it.
Okay, well, I want to sort of refocus back to sort of slightly more contemporary things and go. We asked the panel what they sort of think has been, back to this last 12 months question. Can you discern anything in terms of sort of the design? I mean, obviously, we're seeing much slimmer and, less chunky watches. Is there anything beyond that that you've seen that's, that's going on that you can talk about in design terms? Anyone can go for this.
I think there's more of a return this year to poetry and romanticism in watchmaking. I think we've gone through this, return to classic and the slim watch last year, and I think they're starting to venture back into this area, into making it emotional and romantic again. I'll cite Hermès once again with the time suspended. Van Cleef has brought a ton of beautiful watches out this year, centering around artisan pieces, Cartier, with their beautiful enamels and engravings. I think maybe they're looking to bring more emotion back into it this year.
I agree. I definitely saw a lot of that. And also, I'm not sure I'd call it a trend, but certainly there was people having some fun with the design. There's a Belgian brand that I forget the name. Correct, yes. Who just did some amazing stuff with the dial of their watch. There were no hands on the dial. It's just a series of subdials, and the whole sort of thing moves. And that just it struck me because it was lovely to see something completely fresh, which you don't see that very often.
Well, for me, one of the changes, and I hate to lower the aspirational element after talking about the purity of design, but I think the industry's had an unfortunate reality check because of the global economy, and also, especially with the high-end stuff, is the price of gold. The third element there's been a reality check will be the cessation of movements for affordable prices from the Swatch Group in January, I believe. So this is, as far as I can tell, working from doing articles from the financial side, this is the last year of truly affordable masterpieces because prices are, not because of avarice, but because of reality, prices are going to have to elevate. And I was told on good authority that there will be no purely mechanical steel watches below £1,000 over the next 3 years.
Have you been to the Nomos booth?
Well, you keep going, I know you love Nomos, but I'm talking about, global brands that have wide appeal with names that everyone knows. There won't be a lot of sub-1,000 watches that don't have some connection directly to the Swatch Group or Nomos. And then the gold thing is going to be really a big shock at the luxury end.
Back to the thing, we were talking really about sort of, the sort of look and feel rather than the inside.
Well, that's all part of it, but because it does confirm that the poetry side of it doesn't necessarily have to cost money. And I think it's been a few years now that the downsizing has been coming into play, which is really nice. And I think you mentioned Resonance is just remarkable. And what I like is there's been a bit of a backlash against watches that are literally unreadable.
Yeah, cool. Peter, have you got anything to add on that?
Not very much on there. I think it's, that's how I've said before, I have a rule. The first thing when I look at the watch, I have to be able to tell the time. If I can't tell the time by instantly glancing at it, then it just it's an art piece after that. It's an interesting sort of folly. But you must be able to tell. I don't want to do a mathematical calculation to work out the time. I mean, there's a Swiss guy who does a clock in Switzerland where we live over in Switzerland. I can't remember what it's called, magic clock or something. You just cannot tell the time on it without doing this mathematical calculation. It runs backwards or something, and the numbers go forwards. You've probably seen it, yeah.
Really helpful.
And the other thing is tourbillons. I've got an obsession now with tourbillons. I just don't want to see another one. They're wonderful, but they're not necessarily on wristwatches. They never have been necessarily on a wristwatch. They're just an example of watchmaking ability, because it's very, very difficult to make, or it used to be very, very difficult to make a tourbillon. Now it's quite easy. Chinese will knock you out one for less than $100. So, I love it when people do it, but there's just, please do some other complication rather than a tourbillon. And make the watches smaller. I'm getting it all off my back now, the things. Watches are too big, bracelets too chunky and too heavy, slimmer bracelets, and just bring the thing down to a little bit more sensible size. But that's me, personally. I'm not having to go at
No, fair enough. You talked about sort of alternatives to tourbillon. There are a lot of tourbillon out there, but there are a lot of, interesting complications. I wonder if anyone can sort of come up with something that, that's particularly caught their eye, they particularly loved in the last year or so, or here at the fair, or whatever.
Well, Peter used the word folly, and I don't want people to think of that as a pejorative, because to me, the Harry Winston opuses are the most fun pieces going. I mean, Harry Winston is a jewelry company that enables artists to dream and do whatever they like in a series of limited pieces. The latest one, Opus 11, which has the hour in the middle divided into quadrants that flip over like the old digital clocks with separate quadrants, that is a lot of fun to me. And also I've matured enough to appreciate what Urwerk is doing, which I find to be remarkable pieces. So these are all great. They are what I think, is it Max? Not Max, was the chap from Urwerk, Felix. Felix calls the new complications, because he told me when I was interviewing, I think, for QP, that all of the old complications have been perfected. And for someone his age, which is like 42, to try to redo...
Felix is 35. Sorry, he started really young.
He's a prodigy. But he said, that the tourbillon's been perfected, the perpetual calendar. Why should he do that? Why reinvent the wheel? So that's the motivation, I think, between him and a bunch of the others.
Well, actually, that's an interesting point, because Felix actually takes old complications and modernizes them.
Right.
He's told me on many occasions there's nothing new under the sun in watchmaking, and he gets all of his inspiration in vintage pieces. Everything. All those modernistic Urwerk pieces are actually rooted in something that's 300 years old. All of them.
Well, in fact, you just described the two new pieces launched last week by Parmigiani were wristwatch versions of two watches, pocket watches, massive pocket watches that Michel Parmigiani had restored for the Sandoz collection. And one of them has the hands change length during the course of the day because the case is narrow. So they're like little pantographs. And to do that in a wristwatch, it's bizarre, and it's fun, but as an achievement, it's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I think I'm probably a bit unusual, because complications somehow just don't do it for me. Peter, when you said a watch needs to tell the time, that's kind of where I'm at. I want the thing to tell me the time. So the thing that's yes, I am a fuddy-duddy. Damn it.
What a fool!
So I'm just thinking,
another fuddy-duddy. Huh?
The watch that I liked the most this year was that Reverso, which is the simplest thing you've ever seen in your life. It doesn't even have a seconds hand. But from a design perspective, it's just bang on. It harks back to the original design, and yet looks sort of modern and up to date at the same time. And so the best complication is no complication, I think.
Well, as the only one here wearing a watch without a second hand, I concur.
I would have jumped in. I thought Elizabeth was going to mention this, because she's mentioned it twice already, but it's worth it. It's the Temps Suspendu from Hermès. It's the complication that doesn't complicate. It's an amazing watch. It's it does nothing very complicatedly, which is a huge achievement, and only I think Hermès could have come up and done that. It's absolutely brilliant. Which means I've got to think of the next question. We touched on this a little bit earlier, in terms of sort of poetic sort of ideas coming back into design, and it seems that even here in the salon there's a wider range of crafts sort of going on. Is that something? Is there a real future in that?
Are you referring to the artisanal crafts?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Sorry.
They've always been there. It's just that sometimes they fall further into the background, and sometimes they're brought out into the foreground, depending on what high-profile companies are doing. I find after the quartz crisis, there weren't that many artisans left doing them: enamel, engraving, skeletonizing, guilloche, above all. But there always were some still doing it. Now, where there's more demand, there's more artisans doing it, and thus more apprentices and more people being trained to continue it.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask some questions from you guys if you want in a second, but I just, if you've got a highlight that or a surprise from the show, what have you seen that's, you just really like seeing it again, or has really caught your attention?
I think I've already answered that question with the Reverso. I think that's the watch that sticks in my mind. The Renaissance I was very taken with. I've mentioned that. No, that's me. Yeah.
Did any of you guys see the HD3 slide this year?
Yes.
What did you think of it? The HD3 slide.
Oh, I guess. Yeah, I find it's one of these pieces. Sorry, it's one of these pieces that, again, answers a question that no one really asked. I tend to be with Peter, agree with Peter on these kind of things, in that I totally respect the achievement and the inventiveness, but I am a classicist, and complications really don't float my boat. So I agree with you. To me, the coolest piece here, if I could steal something right now from the show, it would be the Reverso 31.
Well, we should look into that.
Yes, I got a
We're
glass
two big
cutter.
guys. The glass doesn't look that thick.
Well, I like complications. I mean, when I became a watchmaker, I used to look at complicated watches, and they terrified me because I didn't know how to take them apart, put them together, and they were absolutely frightening. So when you first start, you just look at these things in terror, then eventually you sort of get into them, and then they're no longer very complicated. First of all, an automatic watch was complicated. Then it became simple. Then chronographs, then automatic chronograph, then repeating mechanisms, and perpetual calendars. All these things are horrendous when you first have to take them to pieces. But you get to know them, and they're no longer really complications. But they have made life really, really interesting. As a watchmaker, the last thing you want to do if you're actually working as a watchmaker is just do the same old timepiece. The Reverso, I'm afraid, every day would be very, very boring after a while. But at Jaeger, you wouldn't have that problem because they have some wonderfully complex movements to work on. So from the watchmaker's point of view, they're wonderful. And the Hermes, I can't think what it's called, pointless watch, is it, or something? Sorry, suspended time, temps suspendu. It's totally pointless, but it's a beautiful bit of mechanism. I don't suppose I'll be lucky enough to get my hands on one under the dial and work on the mechanism. Maybe someday one will come in, but this is the only problem for the future, that we just haven't got enough watchmakers, and it's going to be a real problem to service these very complex watches as time goes on. And they are now much more complicated than they used to be. When I started, the most complicated watch was probably a clock watch, which you probably don't even heard of nowadays, but because we don't bother to make those. But that was a pocket watch that actually would strike every time it passed the sort of quarter hour, and repeat, and have a chronograph and moon phase and all the other bits and pieces on there. And you sort of worked up to it. That was the ultimate. After that, you didn't have anything else. But now, every time a manufacturer comes out with something new, you have to learn a complete new watch, complete new mechanism, as in the Hermes. It's totally unique.
So, but out of here at the fair, what have you seen that's really, really caught your attention? Yeah.
Well, let's say the Heritage watch is the one, I've got to say, because it's very simple. It's just a timepiece. Well, having said that, they also do a Chinese
the Chinese calendar,
which I don't understand
Chinese
at all.
Round,
it was explained to me in great detail that the Chinese decimal calendar, which is 100 hours in a day or something or other, and the watch indicates that very, very complicated mechanism. So they do a very complicated watch as well. But
does anyone have any questions? Having had a warning that asked the panel, far away. So it's Arno Haslinger, by the way.
What do you think about the current partnerships? For example, Hublot, Ferrari, which is a very recent one, Jaguar, Renault, I think.
I've spent a lot of time writing about partnerships. I don't know why it's fallen in my lap so often, especially automotive ones. It's not new, as you know. It goes back before the war, there were partnerships. The really serious commercial partnerships are within the last 30 years, and the one everyone holds up that has inspired all of these is the Breitling-Bentley, which I believe is financially the most successful. Most of the others have been either minor or gigantic fiascos. Now, I'm not childish enough to be parking my tent in front of St. Paul's, so I appreciate capitalism. And I appreciate what these people are doing. I think the Hublot Ferrari one, because I think it's the 6th brand to try to do this, should be the dernier cri for this kind of behavior. I personally prefer to see a watch that's a watch, and I want my car to be a car. The Bremont thing is different because someone has to make the clock in the Jaguar, for example, or the Parmigiani Bugatti thing is an elegant situation. But trying to create a brand that almost justifies its own store, well, the Panerai Ferrari thing didn't work, and that should have been a match made in heaven.
I think the answer really lies in the individual case. You know, if you've got people from both companies who can see a value in it, even when none really exists, but if they believe it enough themselves, they'll create products that, you know, that have value. I think Jaeger-LeCoultre and Aston Martin, I mean, two completely different companies, but it just happened that people at both companies, you know, saw something in it and have created, you know, interesting, cool products, you know, and, you know, in those terms, it works. You know, some companies are more, you know, it's more obviously a commercial you know, partnership dreamt up in the boardrooms, but you know, in other cases, it's a more organic thing, and you know, along that spectrum lies your answer.
James, if I may, I'm not sure I agree. I think you know what you said just then is very telling. You said it's all about, you know, if people within the two companies see something in it, and that illustrates exactly what the problem is here. What matters is whether the customer sees something in it. And I think for the great majority of these partnerships, the customer doesn't see anything in it at all. It's very little value. You know, my day job is marketing, so I understand completely how someone could have come up with the idea. I'm sure this sounded great in the meeting, but very few of these partnerships mean anything to the end customer, who is actually who counts in the end.
Yeah. No, that's true. But I think, you know, at the same time, it can create interesting products. Elizabeth, anything to say? No? Cool.
I completely agree. I mean, I can only underscore what Ken said. If Panerai and Ferrari couldn't make it, though, I have to wondering about this. I was supposed to go to the Hublot Ferrari launch last week, but I was sick and couldn't. So I didn't hear that would have been the first thing I asked Jean-Claude. I would have asked Jean-Claude, what do you think you're doing when no one else could make this work, particularly Panerai? How do you think this is going to work? But I unfortunately couldn't ask him that. Sure. But it's a very, very valid point. However, what Andrew says, if the customer sees validity in it, if the customer's interested by it, then it has validity. And
it has to be said, I mean, when it comes to Breitling-Bentley, it appears that the customer really does think there's something in it. So,
well, it's interesting because whenever this topic comes up and everyone first exceeds that the Breitling-Bentley thing worked, everyone is equally mystified as to why the Panerai Ferrari one didn't work, since the secret, as you know, with marketing, if you're going to have a collaboration, the two brands have to be of equal level. The big fiasco in watches that gives an example of what didn't work is when Lexus brought out a car in 1998 or 9 to compete with the BMW 3 Series. They didn't look to see what a BMW 3 Series owner would wear as a watch. And he would probably buy a Tag Heuer or an entry-level Rolex because these are guys earning money. The watch they did with the 2000s, whatever the small sporty Lexus was, they brought out a 200-pound quartz Casio that looked like the Dash. So you've got to get it right, which Breitling-Bentley did. Panerai Ferrari should have been a match made in heaven because they're both macho, Italian, sporty, collectible. I'd like to close my bit of this by saying that what I was told by people in the industry that observe all this is that Paneristi don't want a Panerai that says Ferrari, and Ferraristi don't care about Panerai. Breitling-Bentley, on the other hand, created a new product.
Cool.
That's aesthetically very, very pleasing, and it's a well-oiled, well-working machine. But if I may just add to the Panerai thing, personally, I think it didn't work because there was no soul in the watch. It was a product that was supposed to work, and somebody worked hard to make it look like it would, but if you ask me, it was emotionless.
I agree.
Is there anything else? Sure, far away. Tell us who.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Gary Hewitt from Knight as well. The question I have is, in the last 3 or 4 days, the time-lapse Geneva seal customers come out. I don't know whether you think they've gone far enough. I'd also like to hear your thoughts of how that compares with the Patek Philippe seal.
That's, I have to say, something I'm dying to learn the detail of. I think is really interesting.
I don't have all the
development.
details of it either, but I do know that they've updated the Geneva seal to include a lot of new technology, including silicon, including Liga parts. They are now okay for the Geneva seal. I don't think it has time. I don't think the new seal includes timing capability, as far as I'm aware, and that's one thing the Patek Philippe seal does. Does it? Does it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware.
I think, does it actually equal cost in the testing, or surpasses it?
Surpasses COSC?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I have the press release sitting at home. I haven't read it yet.
That's got to be a good thing. I mean, I think what troubles me with the Patek standard is we are telling you our watches are good, and it's Patek. Okay, I believe them, but I think that's just wrong. There's something inherently wrong about that. Whereas, having an independent authority, even if it's perhaps not as independent as it, would like to be, is still a better guarantee. And it's more meaningful, to a user new to what this is all about.
The other thing, of course, is we had a standard. We have a new standard that I find, having read through it, is pretty tough, which is the Fleurier group.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if that's limited to certain manufacturers.
No, not at all. The Fleurier Qualité Fleurier includes COSC, it includes Chronofiab,
Yep.
and it includes their own certification. It's tougher
is tougher than-
it's tougher than all the rest of them.
But it's very, very expensive to get through.
That's
so
the problem.
It's,
Yeah.
pointless. I think that's probably it. So thank you for your patience. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Andrew.